Hello. Welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. My name is Abby Smith, and I'm an ambassador here at the Institute. We have exciting events upcoming this fall. I invite you to look them up on the table back there. Tonight, here's the microphone. Tonight, our guests will be introduced by Ambassador Terry Shoemaker. Terry was a member of the DLC and was President Clinton's co-chairman in New Hampshire and is currently co-chair for Ready for Hillary. Ambassador Shoemaker.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm Terry Shoemaker, as you just learned. I was involved with a bunch of moderate New Hampshire Democrats after Mike Dukakis got trounced by George H.W. Bush in the 1988 presidential election in an effort to try to bring the Democratic Party of New Hampshire from the left wing of the Democratic Party back into the mainstream of politics and the Democratic Party nationally. We started an organization designed for that purpose, and were promptly denounced by the establishment of the New Hampshire Democratic Party. And then we learned that there was this national organization called the Democratic Leadership Council that had been started by tonight's speaker, and which was then headed by a little-known governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, who was the national chair. It's very interesting, and I'm just going to run through the list. I'm glad to see we have one of the other co-founders of the New Hampshire DLC with us tonight. John Broderick, who's in the back row. I'd like to recognize him. John was the first president of the New Hampshire DLC and went on to become Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court and is now Dean of the UNH Law School. Also, somebody else who's very close to St. Anselm College, Mo Arell, who was then the mayor of Nashua, became the first chair of the New Hampshire DLC. A few other names you might recognize that were amongst the founders of the New Hampshire Democratic Leadership Council were Steve McAuliffe, who's now a federal court judge, John Lynch, who was unknown at the time, but he went on to become the first four-term governor of New Hampshire in modern history, George McGlarus, who at that time was chairman of the Stratford County Commissioners and today is chairman of the Stratford County Commissioners. Paul Gagnon, who became U.S. Attorney, Ned Helms, who became New Hampshire Democratic Party chair, and Senator Shaheen, while not a founder, was one of our early board members. All of this took place because in 1985, Al Fromm founded the Democratic Leadership Council nationally. And this organization, whose ideas and political strategies during the last quarter of a century have clearly played a central role in the resurgence of the Democratic Party nationally and its restoration to dominance in our politics. The New York Times in February of 2010 called the DLC under Al Fromm's leadership, listen to this, one of the two most influential think tanks in American history in the era of the broadcast age. In 2000, in a speech in Hyde Park, New York, President Clinton said, "It would be hard to think of a single American citizen who, as a private citizen, has had a more positive impact on the progress of American life in the last 25 years than Al Fromm." As I mentioned, the DLC was founded after a series of crushing, and I hope Al will talk about this, Democratic defeats nationally and at the state level across the country. And many were predicting the end of the Democratic Party. The DLC provided both the action agenda and the ideas for new Democrats to successfully challenge the conventional political wisdom in America and in the process redefine the center of the Democratic Party, which is what we had started out to do here without knowing the DLC existed. Al Fromm played a prominent role in President Clinton's election and in the formation of his administration. He served as domestic policy advisor to the transition team and prompted USA Today to write, "The ideas at the crux of the Clinton candidacy and presidency were largely drafted by the DLC." Before his founding of the DLC, Al was executive director of the House Democratic Caucus, and before the event was regaling Neil Levesque and me with some stories about that. He also served in President Carter's White House. He has written extensively before this book, and his writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and I could go on and on. He's here to talk about his book, The New Democrats and the Return to Power. I've known Al for, it's hard to believe, I've known Al for almost 25 years. And by coincidence, we were both born in South Bend, Indiana. Anybody else here born in South Bend? Okay. I am very, very excited, as I'm sure John Broderick and George Bruno are, that Al is with us tonight. This is going to be a real treat. I urge you all to listen very carefully because the man you're going to hear from has had an enormous impact on American politics. It really can't be overestimated. Without the DLC, and this is my opinion, but without the DLC and its ideas, I'm not at all sure that Bill Clinton would have been elected president. And without the Clinton presidency and the new Democratic agenda set by the DLC, I'm even more confident that New Hampshire would not have had Governor and now Senator Shaheen, Governor Lynch, Governor Hassan, Senate President Larson, and Speaker Norelli, all of whom benefited from the groundwork done by Al Fromm and the DLC. So please welcome tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Terry, for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be back in New Hampshire. I'm glad to be here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. I know that everybody tries to emulate Terry Shoemaker and become an ambassador. But it is terrific. It's terrific to see John Broderick, George Bruno, so many of my friends. Neil, thank you for inviting me, and Ann, thank you so much for taking such a good care of me. I was telling Terry, I saw President Clinton this morning. He and President Bush announced something that they call the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, which is an idea we cooked up. Actually, the idea got started the day I gave Clinton a copy of the manuscript of my book so he would know what he was writing the foreword to. And he said, you know, the DLC, we used to do all this training of leaders. Why don't we do some more of that? And about 2 or 3 months later, Margaret Spellings, who was President Bush's education secretary, was appointed to be head of the new Bush Library in Dallas. And she said to me, do you think there's anything that we could do together? And I said, Clinton wants to do training of new leaders. I'm sure Bush would like to do that. And I'll be damned if this morning they didn't announce it. So it was great to see both of them this morning. I'm just walking through the halls. Neil took me around this institute. It is just so incredible. There's so much political history here. It reminds people like me who think we know something about politics because we've been involved in it a little bit, how much more there is than we even dream about. I mean, it is just incredible You probably learn more political history just walking through this building and seeing who has been in this building than you could almost any place in America. It is phenomenal. On election night, 1980, you all remember that, right? I threw a party and nobody came. By the time the party was supposed to start, it was clear that the Democrats had lost the White House. We were well on our way to losing the Senate, and including a senator up here, John Durkin, who lost that year, and losing dozens of seats and actual, really operational control of the House of Representatives. I lost my job in the White House, and most of those who were invited to the party had lost their jobs too, so we really didn't have any reason to celebrate. Now fast forward just 2 decades. It's June of 2000, and with President Clinton, I'm in Berlin, Germany. Not Berlin, not Berlin, New Hampshire, but Berlin, Germany, with leaders of center-left governments from 14 countries. They were led by Clinton and Tony Blair, and they signed what they called the Progressive Declaration, defining their common approach to governing. Their themes, Terry and John and George and all the people who were involved in the DLC will remember, were opportunity, responsibility, and community. President Clinton was completing 2 successful terms as president, and the new Democratic philosophy, which we all started, including a lot of stuff done up here, was modernizing progressive politics all over the world. My book, which is called The New Democrats and the Return to Power, is the story of the New Democrat political movement, the movement that led the Democratic Party from the political wilderness to political power, and in doing so saved not only the Democratic Party, but I believe progressive government in America from going the way of the Whigs. I want to talk tonight just very briefly, and then I hope we can have some questions, about what we did and the lessons that both parties can learn from us. The New Democrat movement was grounded in the core principles of opportunity and responsibility. To me, that's America's basic bargain. Government and our country needs to provide individuals with the opportunity to go as far as their talents will allow. But people have 2 responsibilities. One is to take advantage of those opportunities, and second, to give something back to the Commonwealth. I learned that bargain in my first job, and some of you are about ready, probably going to have your first jobs pretty soon. My first job was a pretty neat one. I was working for Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law in the War on Poverty in the Deep South. But that's where I learned the importance of this bargain and the importance of empowering citizens and their taking advantage of them. I witnessed that firsthand in some of the poorest places in America that were empowered first politically by the Voting Rights Act, and we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of that incredible achievement. It's hard to believe that where I worked in my first job, Barack Obama could not have voted. Think about that. Think about how much this country has changed. And economically, by the War on Poverty. But more importantly, they took advantage of those opportunities. I just want to talk, ordinarily I wouldn't do this, but I want to talk about 2 people that I met during those times. One, Jesse Brooks, and the other is Jesse Banks. Jesse Brooks was a poor sharecropper in Wilcox County, Alabama. In 1965, when Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference went into Wilcox County after the Selma to Montgomery March, not one African American was registered to vote in the county. My wife, I met my wife down there 2 years later. She was a college student. I was just out of college, and she was a college student who was working for the SCLC, running a youth center, trying to teach 4-year-old black kids to say their name proudly, because they'd say, "What's your name?" "Johnny." We were introduced by one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants, Jesse Brooks, who drove this old pickup truck, so old that when you got in it, you could see the pavement through the worn floorboards. He and the FBI guarded her that summer, and you know, about 2 years later, we were married. He came up to see us. This was 1968 in suburban Washington. Because of Martin Luther King and the Voting Rights Act, black people in Wilcox County had gotten the vote. Old Mr. Brooks took advantage of it, and he came up as the elected tax collector of Wilcox County. In Holmes County, Mississippi, in the late 60s, Shriver sent me down to look at a work-study program. And what I found, this is the America that was only 50 years ago, that young African-American kids were getting their work experience by building segregation academies for the White Citizens Council. 25 years later, and John Broderick and Terry and George will remember Mike Espy, who came up here on our trip that when we came up, Clinton and I came up in August of 1991. Mike was the first black congressman in Mississippi since Reconstruction, and he was the head of our DLC chapter. We were announcing it in Jackson, and I told that story because Holmes County is in Mike's district. And by that time, he was getting 80% of the white vote. And I said, y'all just don't realize how historic this is. Just think about this. I'm done speaking, and this woman who's probably my age now, but was a good 20 years older than I was in 1991, still is probably, comes up to me and says, "My name's Jesse Banks. I'm mayor of Chula, Mississippi in Holmes County. And that white family that ran the Chevy dealership and built those segregation academies has been run out of the county. What I learned in Wilcox County and Holmes County and a whole bunch of other places was that opportunity and responsibility, that basic bargain, can change a country." And that became the core of my personal philosophy and really the cornerstones of the DLC, New Democrat philosophy. You heard it from Clinton a million times: opportunity, responsibility, and community. Those were the three buzzwords of our presidency. In my book, I wrote my book in part because political memories are short. You know, now Democrats control the White House, and in presidential elections, at least, they have a demographic advantage. But just a quarter of a century ago, it was entirely reversed. Terry talked about how far we were in the wilderness. You know that in the 1980s, in those three elections, Democrats won a smaller percentage of electoral votes than any party had ever won in 3 consecutive elections in the history of America since the founding of modern parties in 1828. It could easily be said the party was out of power, out of touch, and out of ideas. The New Democrats were insurgents in our own party. Our vehicle was the Democratic Leadership Council that we created in 1985 after our second, not first, but second 49-state landslide defeat in 4 elections. As President Clinton wrote in the foreword to the book, when we began, we weren't very popular. That's the understatement. Party leaders, as happened here in New Hampshire, tried to shut us down. But as Clinton said, we were determined. And we were determined up here, and we were determined in the country. You can read my book and find, and see what we did and all that. And I'm not going to try to tell the whole story, but let me cover a few highlights. First, the New Democrat movement is an idea movement. And that's the second reason I wrote this book, because I believe that ideas are just terribly underappreciated and undervalued in today's politics. We believed that the intellectual resurgence of our party had to precede its political resurgence. That if we stood for things that the American people wanted to support, voters would return us to national power. So the strategy was to shape a political message and governing agenda that could carry a Democrat to the White House, find a candidate who could run and would run and get elected on that agenda and then govern on it and govern by it while in office. That's very different than going out and getting endorsements or raising money, all of which are important in politics. But I'm old-fashioned, probably just old, but old-fashioned enough to believe that all the great delivery systems in the world don't work if your message is wrong. And you got to get the right message. As Terry said up here, our goal wasn't to accommodate. We didn't care if we were acceptable to party leaders. Our goal was to win. We knew all along that if we did what we had to do to change the image of the party, that a lot of our friends would fall off the reservation, and they did. But we believed that was a necessary price to pay and that eventually they'd come back. Our challenge was not to unify our party, but to expand it. If we had concentrated on unifying the Democratic Party in 1990 or 1989, we would have unified a party that would have never won the White House. We had to get more people to vote Democratic. It's that simple. And because, and again, New Hampshire is such a wonderful example. You don't call it the Granite State for nothing. It's such a wonderful example because it's the independence that Broderick and Terry and Mo Orell and Steve McAuliffe and all those people did, Jeannie Shaheen. You know, I ran into Maggie Hassan out in L.A. a couple of years ago, and she said, you know, I know you because I used to go to the National Conversation, the DLC. But the independence was so important, and because we knew we couldn't prevail, and Bruno knows more about this than any of us because he's played in all these arenas, but we knew we couldn't prevail in sort of regular party forums. And so we created our own playing field. And as I like to say, we created a playing field where we had the home field advantage. And that was critical. We nurtured a new generation of Democratic leaders. When we came up here, we brought, some of them got sacrificed along the way. And, you know, when we came up here in '91, Clinton brought Mike S.B. Jill along and Steve Solars, all of them lost in 1994. Maybe it wasn't such a good omen that they came up with him. But basically, we created a whole new generation of leaders. You know, they're now old and retired, but you know, Sam Nunn, Chuck Robb, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Dick Gephardt, Bill Gray, you know, Bruce Babbitt, Joe Biden was young once, believe it or not. All those people were part of the DLC and the traveling parties we put together in 1985. We organized our own forums and conferences around the country, including the one we did up here in August of 1991, probably one of the most important. But you know, with all we did, probably the thing that gave us more momentum than anything else was Mike Dukakis's loss in 1988. Because we, for those of you, as you go through and look at all the pictures and study the history, you know, you'll learn that what a lot of the Democrats thought after until '88 was we were running against Ronald Reagan. He was this remarkable communicator. But once Reagan got out of the way, we were going to win. And I'm sure some of you were in Atlanta the night that Mike Dukakis accepted the nomination, and we were up by 17 points. There wasn't a Democrat in the country who thought we were going to lose that race, except me. So that was the thing that really gave us an opportunity. You know, every once in a while you do these things that sound, you're just trying to, when you're under political pressure, you try to do things that will sort of parry the pressure a little bit. And going into the '88 convention in Atlanta, it was clear that Dukakis wasn't our candidate, and we didn't have one, really. Some of the early DLC members ran, but they were, unlike Clinton, they it was just too early for them to run as DLC candidates. They had to sort of try to blend in like everybody else. And so Jim Murray of the Wall Street Journal at the time asked me about Dukakis, and I said, you know, he's erased the graffiti from the wall, but he hasn't painted the mural. In other words, he wasn't the same kind of old-fashioned interest group politician that Walter Mondale was, but he hadn't really defined his own agenda, and so in the campaign, Bush had defined it for him, and that was why we lost by almost as much as we lost in the previous 2 elections. And so it gave us our mission, which was to paint the mural in between 1989 and 92. In April of 1989, I went down to Little Rock. I offered Bill Clinton, this little-known governor at the time, the chairmanship of the DLC. I told him we'd pay for his travel around the country, and we'd work on an agenda with him, which he was very eager to do. And I said, you know, I think you'll be president someday and we'll both be important. And he said, okay, I'll take that deal. And so we went off. We had a 4-part strategy, real simple. The first was reality therapy. One of the things that political parties never do is be honest about why they lose. Republicans have that problem right now. Then, you know, it's always because the other guy had a good candidate, because the ads were better, whatever it is, but it's not ever because you don't stand for things that people don't want to support. And so we laid it out in bloody terms, and, you know, people in the party didn't like us very much. You're having Elaine Kmart come up here in a couple of weeks. Come see her. She and she's now at Brookings, but as was her partner in crime in 1989, Bill Galston. They're both at Brookings now. They wrote a piece called "The Politics of Evasion for the DLC, Democrats and the Presidency," that went through all the polling data, exit polling. We didn't do any of our own polling on this. All the historical voting trends, and showed that people didn't support the Democratic Party because they didn't trust us on the economy. They thought we were reckless with their values and we wouldn't defend the country. And there's not really much reason to vote for a president. And so that was the first thing. We had to lay a political predicate so we could drive big change home. The next thing we did was we wrote a philosophy. It's called the New Orleans Declaration. And a lot of people would look at it and say, you know, everybody believes in that, but the problem is people didn't think Democrats did. The promise of America is equal opportunity, not equal outcome. Economic growth is the prerequisite to opportunity for all. People have responsibility to give something back to the country. At Hyde Park, the important part of the speech, not what he said about me, but the important part of the speech that Clinton gave, he took. There were 20 principles in the New Orleans Declaration. He took every one of them, and he showed how everything he did in his administration stemmed from that. He said the New Orleans Declaration was both the platform and the framework that led to the success of the administration. So the first thing we did is told people what we believed in. Just a very simple declaration of 20 principles. Then we went around the country, and these guys were all involved in that. As we led to the Cleveland Convention, which was in 1991, and Clinton and I and Sam Nunn and Dave McCurdy and Chuck Robb and a whole bunch of people traveled all over the country, and we just had forums on ideas. We created this little think tank called the Progressive Policy Institute. They cranked up ideas, and those ideas wound up changing America. Now, you know, you think about a president, you think about Air Force One. There's a picture of Terry in front of Air Force One somewhere in this building. Maybe it's not, is it in this room? Okay, back here. Anyway, but in those days, we didn't quite fly on Air Force One. Clinton threw a book party in New York, and he said his most vivid memory of me is putting him in unsafe airplanes. So one time we were flying, we were in Denver, and we had to be in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was, we're 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning in Denver. We had to be in Cheyenne for a lunch. It was the worst blizzard that I've ever seen. And they said we really shouldn't fly, but some of you may know that after New Hampshire, in those days, Wyoming caucuses were one of the earliest events. And we had somebody you all would know, Kathy Carpin, who was the Secretary of State, was our host with Mike Sullivan, the governor, and the caucus was going to be in Kathy's basement. And so Clinton wasn't going to miss that no matter what. So we get in this airplane, and we're flying up over the Rockies in this terrible blizzard. And what we thought were clouds were really snow-covered mountaintops. And I knew we were in trouble. I mean, all our knuckles were white. And when Clinton picked up the cell phone and tried to call Hillary to say, I might not talk to you again, but, I love you. It was, one time we were in North Carolina, flew into Raleigh, and North Carolina was playing the University of Kentucky. And so Clinton wanted to go to the game. And so, as was the custom, as a Republican governor, but the governor has a state trooper pick us up. And we had 2 cars in our entourage. We drive to the Dean Dome. We park our car. State police says, leave your car right here in front of the Dean Dome. We go in and watch the game and came out, and the campus police had towed our car. When those things I don't think happen when you're president of the United States, but when you're just traveling as chairman of the DLC. I spent more time at the campus police station in Chapel Hill trying to get that car back because it belonged to somebody that Clinton thought was going to be important in the campaign than we did any other event on that trip. But the key thing was when we went to Cleveland, and I can't remember, you guys were probably there. Were you there at Cleveland? We had everybody in the Democratic Party protesting. But we passed an agenda with ideas that changed America. Think about it. AmeriCorps. Going to have the 20th anniversary at the White House on Friday of AmeriCorps. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the largest anti-poverty program in the history of the country, moved tens of millions of people from welfare to work. Welfare reform. Again, changing a system that was keeping people in dependency into a work system. Charter schools. Community policing. Changed the whole policing system in America. You know where we found that? From Reuben Greenberg, an African-American Jewish police chief in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places, who decided in the early 1980s that sort of the high-tech, squad car, rapid response approach to law enforcement wasn't working. So he said, I'm going to put police back on the beat and work with the community. That turned into community policing and 100,000 cops. It changed every city in America. You think about all of these ideas that came out of that, and none of them would have been accepted by were part of the party orthodoxy. Our economic growth strategy of fiscal discipline, investment in people and technology, and expanded trade, people think, well, people support that. Not when you're dealing with a vested interest in the political parties in Washington. We never would have gotten support for the Earned Income Tax Credit, I believe, if we had had a senator instead of Governor Clinton as chairman of the DLC, because the pressures inside the caucus not to do the Earned Income Tax Credit and to only do the minimum wage, which can't get you to what the progressive goal ought to be, at least in my view, which is that everybody who works full-time year-round, support a family, ought to have a wage above the poverty level. You can't get the minimum wage high enough to do that, even with the living wage, without absolutely disrupting the economy, but you can do it with a targeted Earned Income Tax Credit, and we were well on the way in the Clinton years of doing that. In any event, Clinton did the speech of his life in Cleveland, and then we had to do the fourth part of the strategy, which is we had to market test it. And the only way you market test it is with a candidate, and that's why we came to New Hampshire in August of '91, and Bill Clinton came up here and owes his life, his political life, to that fateful New Hampshire primary in 1992. My daughter's bat mitzvah was the Saturday after the New Hampshire primary. But I was up here at the day's end. Terry will remember those days. And I'll never forget when we decided to go out and say he was the comeback kid based on the early exit polls. You know, New Hampshire has brought a lot of innovation to politics, but none greater than this idea of expectation. I mean, I was the victim of it in 1972 because I worked for Ed Muskie. People don't realize Ed Muskie won almost, what was it, 48% or something like that. I think he won the primary 47, 48 to 39. But there's not a person in the world who doesn't think that George McGovern won that primary because Muskie said he was going to win 50% and he didn't do it. That sort of brought the expectations game in, and boy, we used that night with the comeback kid. You know what Paul Tsonga's margin was, and you all know that. He won by 8 points in New Hampshire. If we had not come out at 6 o'clock and been the comeback kid and had the news that whole night as the comeback kid, people would have looked at those returns and said, Clinton got his rear end kicked in New Hampshire. He can't go on to the South. Broderick, I know, because I was at his law office, sitting at the desk of his his old partner, former Republican governor, and calling Sam Nunn, saying, you know, after those early exit polls, say, Sam, you cannot desert us in Georgia. Nunn was all upset about Jennifer Flowers and the draft letter, and I said, you got to give him one more week. You got to stick with him through Georgia. And then, of course, he went down and won the southern primaries after New Hampshire, and you all turned him around. I've got so many other stories to tell you, but I want to move quickly to some lessons you can learn. But I want to give you a very important date in history that nobody will ever recognize as an important date except me. July 14th, 1987. That was the day Bill Clinton decided not to run in 1988 and instead really get involved in the DLC. Probably turned out pretty good for both of us. But, you know, there was a time in 1990, the end of 1990, 1991, that the DLC was split between Sam Nunn and Clinton. And it wasn't clear which one would be the DLC candidate or whether either one would run. And we had this meeting of Nunn and Clinton and me, and Chuck Robin decided that we were going to go around the country between the first of the year and May of '91, when we were going to release our platform at Cleveland. And Nunn was going to take the heavy lifting because Clinton had a legislative session to begin in '91. But as usual, something always happens on the road. And what happened was that we had the Gulf War. Nunn led the opposition to the Gulf War, got hammered in Georgia, lost his appetite for national politics. He left the Senate shortly thereafter. And Clinton got everything he needed to do done in the legislature about 3 days, so he was raring to go, and we were back on the road. But there were all sorts of things like that happened over those times. But what I want to say, just to conclude, is that the New Democrat philosophy, its animating principles of opportunity for all, its ethic of mutual responsibility, its core value of community, its emphasis on private sector growth and empowering government that equips people with the tools to get ahead, and its embodiment of basic values like work, family, faith, individual liberty, and inclusion are, to me, as viable today as they've ever been in American politics, or as they were in the 1990s. So I think there are lessons for both parties in what we did. For the Democrats, and I think this is really important, particularly with the new emergence of more populist Democrats, there are two things that Democrats can never forget. One is it is critically important for Democrats to grow the private economy. A famous winner of the New Hampshire primary, Paul Tsonga, told me one time when I was in the Carter White House I was deputy advisor to Carter on inflation, so we got the inflation rate higher than his popular or his approval ratings were. But Tsongas said, you know, Democrats need to understand that you can't keep passing out the golden eggs if you don't worry about the health of the goose. And so for Democrats who want to redistribute wealth, and that's fine to me, but you got to grow the economy first. You got to increase the pot if you want more, and then make sure more people can benefit from it. And the second thing that we have to do, and I think you see that with this president, that it's really important. You see the consequences of not doing it. And that is, we've got to constantly be on the cutting edge of reforming government. Democrats have a different idea than Republicans do about government. We believe government is good. We think it's the agent by which we do the public's good, by which we help ourselves and each other. But if it's your agent, it's got to be effective and efficient. And if you let it atrophy, if you let people lose faith in government as they have again, they're going to vote Republican. So that is very important for my party, and we saw it this fall. I mean, we're starting to get over it now, but the fiasco with the launch of Obamacare was devastating to the Democrats because it just drove people's faith in government straight down. And they think of us as the government party, so it's really important to be always on the cutting edge of reform. For the Republicans, they've got probably bigger challenges. One, they can't let the extreme parts of the Tea Party define them. You know, what rallies troops in low turnout primaries or gerrymandered congressional districts repels swing voters in a general election, in a presidential election. We learned that in the 1980s when our left was driving people into the Republican camp, and they need to understand that now. They probably need a group like the DLC. It's a little late for this cycle. But the people who want to win the White House in the Republican Party have got to grab control of the party, because if they don't, they're not going to win it. The second thing they need to understand is that ideas are important. If you don't stand for things people want to support, they're not going to vote for you. You got to give candidates something to run on. And I mean, think about Mitt Romney. He won the primary up here. He's not a bad person. If Mitt Romney in Massachusetts would have run for president, he probably would have been elected. But he gets in those Republican primaries, and the nutcases tell him that you know, his you know, with so much of his family coming from Mexico or living in Mexico, you know, that basically his position on immigration ought to be self-deportation. I mean, if you tell people by what you stand for that you don't want them to vote for you, guess what? They won't. And just one little number, if Romney had won the same percentage of Hispanic voters that George W. Bush won in 2004, he'd been president right now. Think about that. So we have a demographic advantage, but if they get smart, flip that in a hurry. The third lesson for them is that they got to forget about party unity. It's overrated. For the Republicans, party unity on the grounds that are acceptable to the most extreme part of the party is a sure loser. I mean, that's what you get when you. That's why you get a divide. That's why you close down the government. I mean, when you're dealing with people in your party, and it doesn't matter which party or if you're on the right or the left, that are very extreme, and they're not going to give. If your value is unity, you move over there so everybody's unified, you're going to be out of the mainstream. It's not very complicated. I mean, we're accused so many times of, you know, dividing the Democratic Party, to which I pleaded guilty. Because, as I said, my view was we had to expand it. The most important thing the Republicans have to do is they've got to become more inclusive and more tolerant. As I mentioned on Hispanics, Romney could have been president if he would have if he won 40% of the 45% of the Hispanic vote. But Republicans have got to learn that in 21st century America, you need to tolerate and accept people who have different views or different cultural, you know, ideas on cultural issues. I just want to end with one quick thing about Clinton and on abortion, because it's very instructive. You know, Democrats used to get hammered by the pro-life people. And, you know, you can argue whether there are more pro-life people or more pro-choice people. But the way Clinton handled abortion was the way Republicans ought to handle tough cultural issues of today. His formula was legal, safe, and rare. Nobody had any doubt he was pro-choice because he thought abortion ought to be legal. And when you look at the numbers, at least in those days, and my guess is it's not a lot different today, you got a hardcore 20, 25% that are pro-hardcore, pro-life, same thing, maybe a little bit more pro-choice. Then you got this big block in the middle that I would call sort of softly pro-life. They don't like abortion, but they, you know, think there may be circumstances where you might have to have abortions. Those are the people you talk to. What was happening to us was those people, we were so turning them off on abortion and crime and welfare and other issues that they wouldn't even listen to all the ideas that we had that they agreed with us on. And that's a really important point in politics because we used to hear all the time people agreed with us on 12 of 14 issues. The two they didn't were the economy and defense, but who cares? Those are the two they didn't were the reason they voted for president. But sometimes what you have to do is cut your losses because what you want people to do is listen to you. And so what Clinton did on abortion is said to those soft pro-life people, you know, they'd say, you know, Clinton, he's pro-choice, but you know what? He really doesn't like abortion because he thinks they ought to be rare. So let's see what he has to say on other issues. They did that. We sucked them in, and they voted for us. We won a big enough percentage. I mean, we ran, I think, 20 or 25% better than Gore did, for example, among that sector of the electorate. And that was the difference between a tie for Gore and a 5-point victory. Those are the kind of things that the Republicans have to learn. Now, it's not my business to advise Republicans, but I hope they do look at what we did because as long as extremists dominate the presidential agenda in the Republican Party, it will reduce pressure on the Democrats to adhere to the center and to govern effectively as well. And America needs more than that. Our democracy really depends on two strong parties. You see it here in New Hampshire, where you don't have party registration. Debating ideas and debating ideas that make the country better in fighting for the privilege of national leadership. You're going to have that chance again. Boy, it's hard to believe, but it's coming up. In another year, those candidates are going to be up here hammering away at you. And hold them to high tests. And tell them y'all up here think that ideas are important because it is so important for our country to lift the national debate again. I think that's what we did. To be honest with you, I think that's what Ronald Reagan did in a different way, from a different angle in 1980. And I hope that a candidate, and I have one in mind, might be able to do that again in 2016. But thank you. Happy to answer any questions you guys have. Right.
Not really a question, but more a comment about the fact that I think the Democrats need to be able to take the values, keep them simple, and get them across. I mean, when you think about people like Joe the plumber, yeah, they shouldn't be Republicans. Those should be Democrats. And I always marvel at the fact that I know so many people who tend to, they think they're Republicans, but they don't really know. Nobody reads anything anymore, nobody understands anything, where the message just doesn't get across. And I think that your point about take the message about values and talk to people about security and safety and translate that. So that's how it feels to people, instead of the scare tactics that we hear from the other side. I was thinking about Michael Dukakis and reflecting on that, and I was thinking about the whole Willie Horton.
Right.
And how we were fearful about, you know, God, she's going to empty the prisons and this will be horrible. But that's what people listen to. They listen to the sound bites. And if we could sort of boil it down into values that we can all, that we all espouse, we just don't all know it. You know, being inclusive and caring about one another and taking care of people and not relying on government for everything, but being accountable and responsible for ourselves. You know, how do we do that? And then how do we do it in time for the midterm elections so we don't lose our shirts next time around?
Well, let me start with the second part, the midterm elections. It's very hard to do in midterm elections. I mean, I think the way you do it, the way you have a higher calling in politics, is it's got to come from the presidential candidates and from the president. I mean, you know, if you look at the midterms, the Republicans have such a demographic advantage. In 2012, we won 1.8 million more votes for Congress than the Republicans did. Think about that. 1.8 more million people across America voted for the Democrats in Congress than the Republicans, but because the way districts are drawn, the Republicans have a majority. So, I mean, you know, there's no chance unless, you know, there's this gigantic national earthquake that the Republicans will lose the House before 2022 if there's another redistricting. And, you know, we get killed because that's why all these races that people like me don't probably pay enough attention to are really important. All these legislative races, you know, having Maggie Hassan as governor is important because then Democrats, even if you have Republican legislature, Democrats have a say in the redistricting, and that's important. In the Senate, interesting enough, is the same thing. There are too many small, all-white states, and so there's New York and California and Wyoming and Idaho all have the same number of senators. So I think if we hadn't had a lot of help from the Republicans in the last 3 elections, they would already control the Senate. But, you know, I mean, one of the guys that you all know because we worked with at DLC, Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, when he was running last time, I couldn't get anybody in America to call him because Mike Castle, the former Republican congressman, was running and he was going to win the seat. And then Castle gets beat in their nutcase primary by the witch. And everybody in America jumps on Chris Coons' bandwagon. Well, that happened in Delaware. Frankly, it saved Harry Reid in Nevada. It saved Mike Bennett in Colorado. It elected Joe Donnelly in Indiana. So you can go through, and there are probably a couple others where that happened. So to me, I think that where I'd start is focusing on the presidential, which is why you all in New Hampshire are in such a catbird seat. Because in our system, there's only one person who speaks to the whole country. Everybody else has a specific jurisdiction. There's only one person who speaks to the whole country, and it's important. And the Republicans haven't been very good about doing it, and too often we're not very good either about doing it to make the presidential campaigns about something, about beliefs, about values, about ideas. Ideas really matter, and not just about personalities. I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, when I went down to Little Rock to recruit Clinton, It was in the aftermath of Gary Hart and all the problems he had in dropping out of the race. I think Clinton, whether he'd ever say this or not, probably wouldn't, understood that he had to make it an idea-oriented campaign. He didn't want to campaign on all the personal issues that were going to come up. And so he focused on that. That's why what we did at the DLC was such a perfect match for him. I disagree with Terry. I mean, Clinton is such a skilled politician. He could have probably been president if he'd never known any of us. But we were really important to him because it gave some substance and gave some gravitas to what he was talking about in his values. And he had ideas that reinforced them. President Obama's been sort of a different breed, cat on that, because Obama's politics has never really been about what he's done. If Clinton had to be judged on what he'd done, he'd been thrown out of office if it hadn't been for the record he achieved as president. I mean, Clinton leaves office with a 30% personal approval rating and 66% performance approval rating. That's what kept him in office. So it's really important. Obama doesn't get, at least, I mean, it changes once you get to be president, but he was never judged on what he did, but who he was. And it's important for the country. I mean, I don't say that as criticism, but he never was forced to do the kind of grinding on ideas and values because he was a symbol of so much of that. But that's not enough when you get into the day-to-day battles of trying to govern a country. And so I think if I were living in New Hampshire, and I was lucky enough to have people who wanted to be president come to visit me, I'd really push them on the very questions you're talking about, because what they say here will affect them throughout the whole time. And you have that opportunity, and you ought to use it. Mr. Bruno.
Oh, Al, I think of those old days that you've been talking about, and I fast forward to the future, to present day, and I'm concerned that Democratic Party is losing its voice. When it came time to vote for immigration reform,
right,
under the Bush administration, it was the Democrats that pushed back on it. When it came up for, when the Patriot Act came up for a vote, and all of the personal intrusions that act contained, Democrats didn't say anything. And after we had the economic meltdown in the United States that, drove families into the ground, not one Wall Street fat cat has been indicted. And so I'm just wondering where those strong Democratic voices are these days to sort of put us on the right course. Because I'm not seeing them right now.
That's a very good question. The leadership has to come from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It has to come from National Party leaders. It's got to come from executives, from governors. It's not, I love a lot of members of the Senate, but it's very hard to have that kind of leadership and voice out of the Congress. It takes courage. It takes political courage. You were around in those days. I mean, when we went to Cleveland, I'm probably going to insult a bunch of people in this room, but we had, and what we did in Cleveland was pass the agenda that Clinton took to the American people and won the presidency on, okay? And who was out there? Jesse Jackson was protesting for 2 days. The UAW was, they didn't call it a picket because they had too many of their friends in the room, but they were leafleting because we were for NAFTA. In those days, this is 1991. The teachers' unions were going crazy because we were for charter schools. It was even before there was a Charter School Act, even in Minnesota. We had so many of the Democratic constituencies going after us, and we are a constituency party. What makes the parts, the whole greater than the parts, is what comes out of the national candidates. And if you let, as Walter Mondale did, good and decent man, but he was, I just give you an example. And you know, this, I will never forget this. I mean, it's one of these things that had made a big impact on me and on what I tried to do with the DLC. In 1984, Mondale's running. And he goes up to Minnesota, and for a month or 2 weeks or something, he had all these interest groups come up, one at a time. And at every night, he would get their endorsement, and he'd go out on his front porch and say, I'm the, you know, the environmental president with the environmentalist. I'm the, you know, the teachers president with the teachers union. I'm this with this group. I'm this with that group. All individual. He could have had the same people come up, only mixed them. Brought them all up, you know, brought different groups of mixed of these same groups. Could have gone out on his porch at night and said, all of these people are going to endorse me. They all have important interests that I believe in. But we agree on one thing. The national interest in doing what's right for the country is more important than any of their individual interests, and that's why they're endorsing me, and that's where they're going to fight for. That's what a president has to do. You know, he has to have vision. You got to tell people where you want to go, and then you got to be willing to fight for it. And I mean, I wish they'd take pollsters out of the White House. I mean, Clinton told me the other day that when you're president, you want to do a tough thing. If you wait for public support to do it, you'll never get it. But if you don't do it, you're really doing damage. You'll do yourself more political damage than if you'd done it against the public will, or where the polling was at the time. And, you know, the answer to your question, George, is there's not enough of it. People ask me a lot. You know, many of you probably know the DLC. I left in 2009. Succeeded by Bruce Reed, who became Biden's chief of staff in 2011. When he went downtown, I was still chairman of the board. I said, I'm shutting this down. We were in, you know, we put the thing together to break the losing streak in presidential elections. We succeeded. We had 8 good years. I probably should have shut it down in 2000, but you always hope that it's going to, you're going to recreate the wheel, and it never happens. But I get a lot of people come to me and say, you know, why can't we have a DLC again? I say, where's the political leadership? Where are the people like, you know, whether you agreed with them on everything or not, Sam Nunn and Chuck Robb and Bill Clinton, Johnny Breaux, who fought for stuff. And that's what, I don't see it in our party anymore. I certainly don't see it in the Republican Party. I mean, but again, hold them to a tough test up here. I mean, you know how to do that. You've done it, and we've come out with some good candidates because of it. But there's my old mentor, Gillis Long of Louisiana, who nobody's ever heard of. Gillis Long is the reason we have, he and Lyndon Johnson are the reason we had civil rights bills in America, because he's from the most redneck district in central Louisiana. But he got elected to Congress in 1962. His first vote in 1963 was to expand the Rules Committee so that so John Kennedy could have the votes to get civil rights legislation to the floor. He was beaten for re-election in 1964 over that vote by his cousin Speedy Long, only in Louisiana, as the man who voted against the South. Gillis, like everybody else in his delegation, voted against the Civil Rights Bill, but he had cast the vote that allowed the bill which had the votes to pass if it could get the floor to pass. And Gillis always told me that what you need is the compassion to care and the toughness to govern. And he said there are some things where you just have to say, you believe in something and you don't care what the political consequences are. If you lose your seat, you lose your seat. And there just aren't enough people like that anymore. You know, because you actually get to talk to candidates as opposed to watch their TV ads, you got to make that point over and over and over again.
You guys have one more.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Al, welcome back to New Hampshire.
Glad to be here, man.
It's a pleasure to hear you. This is my question. When President Clinton, then Governor Clinton, came here in October of 1991 as an announced candidate for the presidency, he had 3% name recognition. Not 3% favorable, 3% name recognition. Right. The primary was in February. A lot of money back then in a filing period would be $3 million. That was a lot of money to report you had raised. And my concern is this. I know you spent your lifetime successfully, by the way, on the power of ideas. And in Bill Clinton's case, at a different time, it worked. My question is Bill Clinton possible today in a political process that is soaked through with money, independent expenditures, and special interest money? Could Bill Clinton out there break through the noise to be heard with his ideas? It seems to me one of the greatest threats to American politics is the amount of money spent at the margins. Bill Clintons of the world can't play today because they don't have the name recognition or the money, and no one will hear the ideas. And as someone who's devoted his life to promoting ideas and seeing them executed, I wonder what your thoughts are about money in politics and whether they pose a real threat to idea generation.
Well, there's too much money in politics, clearly. You know, I remember those days. We used to go around the country, and Clinton's joke was, my national name recognition is 1/2 of 1% because that's the number of people there are in Arkansas. And, but, you know, John, I have to believe that, yes, you could have another candidate who would run that campaign. Would it be the same? Of course not. Would you need to get money? Yes. But I cannot believe there isn't a responsive group of rich people in this country who would respond to somebody who offered an agenda for national leadership again. I just can't believe that. You know, do I think money in politics is important? Yes. I hate the negative ads. I don't watch them. I hate getting, you know, whatever it is, 150 emails a day from candidates. You know, all these people who used to say I had ideas now only want my money. And I don't want to give it to them because I know what's going to happen to it. It's going to go right to the political consultants, and they're going to dump it into, you know, negative ads, and I don't want to do that. But I just have to believe, and it may be naive, I just have to believe that he can only go so far without anything to say and with only negative things to say, and that the country would respond. I mean, of course, you know, the money, the television ads are important, but nobody, I mean, people don't even watch TV networks anymore. You know, with all the new ways to get ideas out, and I'm sure candidates who are much smarter about all the new technologies than I would ever be could figure out how to promote a positive, constructive agenda for in the national interest and for national strength and national opportunity as they can all these negative ads. I just got to believe that. And I mean, as I said, you're going to have a primary. I have no idea whether my friend and Terry's friend is going to run. Hillary Clinton. If she does, I hope she will do what she didn't do last time, but what Bill Clinton did. I mean, to me, among the most valuable things in his campaign he did were those new covenant speeches at Georgetown. He laid out his campaign and his government. I mean, if you go back, look at the October 22nd, 1991, the first new covenant speech at Georgetown. You know, was it Roosevelt's speech to the Commonwealth Club in 1932? Maybe not, but it was pretty close. He laid out the kind of understandings that were really at the heart of going to be at the heart of his presidency. And when a candidate does that and tells people what he or she is going to do, then when they get in trouble in a campaign, they don't have to revert just to negative campaigning. They actually have something to fall back on. I don't know how many times during the Clinton years when things weren't going well, including after 1994 when we lost all of our friends in the Congress, he went back to the New Orleans Declaration. I mean, a core set of beliefs, as this lady in the second row said, are really important. And you know, if candidates would invest a little bit of their money at the front end of a campaign in doing that, and then try to invest more of the gazillion dollars they're going to raise for the campaign, and maybe even get some of these independent groups to get behind a real agenda, you probably could do it. Now, I'm not, you know, I don't know anything about running campaigns and, you know, with a gazillion dollars going against you. But I just can't believe that you get to a point in the country where ideas and what you stand for and what you want to do for the country doesn't matter anymore. It just can't be, because people aren't going to allow it. The people are not going to allow it. You may get by for 1 or 2 cycles, but then there'll be, you know, all the people who put, you know, whatever they are, the Koch brothers and whoever the guys are on our side who just, Soros and the gang, who just keep dumping money in. At some point, people are going to say, we don't want to pay attention to that. We'd like a candidate who actually want to do something good for us. And again, there are only 2 or 3 places in this country where you have the ability at the beginning of the campaign to have these kind of personal interactions with the candidates. One of them is a state, is Iowa, where you have a caucus, which is a skewed political event. But the thing that makes New Hampshire, and I didn't always believe this, incidentally. I always thought it was too small of a state to make the judgment. But I've come to understand that because it's a primary and everybody can vote, and because independents can vote in either primary, this is a real test, and it's a good test. And candidates need to come up and compete up here. But anyway, George, I cry out for political courage. That's what I really cry out for. But somebody's going to do it, and John Broderick, I can't believe that the country isn't going to respond. All right. Thanks.
On behalf of the students, staff, and faculty of St. Edmundson College, we'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much. Delighted to come. Great.